Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Recha Kudash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Genesis, the 49th chapter. And in this chapter, it deals with as Jacob nears his death, he calls his sons to basically tell them, right, what would, as we're about to read here, what would happen to them in the last days, what state condition they would be in, and so on, i.e. their descendants. Cool. And so, Genesis 49 is also one of the chapters that we use, right, in identifying who the 12 tribes are today. Okay. And one thing which is important to mention is when you go through the book of Genesis, the 49th chapter, it is easier to pair, right, and highlight the traits, right, and events that Jacob mentioned to the different tribes once you already know, right, who the tribes actually are, right. But if you didn't have a clue, right, of who the tribes are, what category of people they would come from, this would be really difficult, if next to impossible, if not impossible, to be able to pinpoint exactly what people, right, this would basically identify. And this is why the Lord had the 12 tribe sign that we have today, be revealed, right, through the Spirit to the elder high priest Ariah, right. That's why the Lord gave him that revelation to be able to link it so that we can have, that ground upon which, when you go into this chapter and you start to link up, right, with other chapters, the prophecies, you can highlight now, okay, this is why it says that Reuben would be like this, or Judah or Gad or Simeon and Levi would be like this. And then you can look at those people, you can link it in, together, and then it makes sense, right? Because had it been just based off of, just read it and figure it out, then the Lord wouldn't have had need to bring that divine revelation, right? But nevertheless, Barak Atah Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai for giving us that understanding. So let's go into the book of Genesis, the 49th chapter. And Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. So clearly, when he's saying things that may befall you, he's referring to their descendants or the tribes that would come of them. Gather yourselves together and hear, ye sons of Jacob. Now I want to see if this, amazing. All right, let's pull up the NLT on here, make life much easier. So as it says here, gather yourselves together and hear, ye sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel, your father. Right? So basically, come together and listen and hearken, take heed to what I'm about to tell you. Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength. And the reason why I pulled this chapter up in the NLT is because some of the wording, is remember they're speaking in old English here, right? Sometimes it's a bit clearer when you reword it in modern English. But dealing with Reuben, right, he says here, thou art my firstborn, and Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob by Leah, and the beginning of my strength, right? And when you read this in the NLT, it says here, you are my firstborn, my strength, the child of my vigorous youth, right? Because it was in Jacob's youth and power and strength that he had Reuben, his firstborn. The excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. As you can see here, you were first in rank and first in power. And Reuben, which in the Hebrew is Ra'albin, right? We went through this when we read about their births, right, when they were born. Today are the Seminole Indians, okay? At least that's how they're called today, the Seminole Indians. And as I mentioned, the excellency of dignity and excellency of power. And when you go into that word dignity, it's basically like they carry themselves to a very high standard, okay? And likewise, as it says, the excellency of power. And so this also goes into like one of their character traits, right? When you read in Genesis 49, some things Jacob mentions, which is likely this was revealed to him, right? Just to foresee it. That's why he told him that. But some things he mentions are concerning either their location, right? Or an event that would happen to them, or even their characteristics that would stand out or about them so much that it would be noticeable or prevalent in the last days, especially in helping identify who they are. So let's read a little bit here about the Seminole Indians before we continue. So it says here the word Seminole, I just typed in Seminole in Wikipedia, is likely from the Spanish cimarrones, meaning wild one, untamed, or runaway, as opposed to the Christianized natives who had previously lived in the mission villages of Spanish Florida. In the 17th century, the Spanish in Florida used cimarron or cimarron to refer to Christianized natives who had left their mission villages to live quote unquote wild in the woods. Some of the Hichiti or Miccosukee speakers who had settled in Florida identified themselves to the British as Cimarron. Muskogean languages have no R sound, replacing it with I. Let's see what else. Yeah, and then it goes into a bit more here, but you can read a lot more, right? It goes into like the culture and so on and so forth. But going back to Genesis 49, it says here, unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed. Then defiledest thou it. He went up to my couch. And what Jacob's referring to here is what Reuben did in sleeping with Jacob's concubine. Okay. And I believe it might have been Bilhah. Let me see if we cross-reference this, it'll give us that. Oh, wait. No, it's not. But I can just pull that up here. But basically, that's what Reuben did, and that cost him. Okay, let me see. Reuben heard. Here we go. Yeah, Genesis 35 and 22. And it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land, this is dealing with Jacob, that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And Israel heard it. So he found out. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. So it doesn't say here, the details of what happened. But we see here that in terms of what would happen to Reuben, it says here, unstable as water, right? And when you look at it in the NLT, it says, but you are as unruly as a flood. Now, when you look at the word unstable, pachaz, it says here, recklessness, wantonness, unbridled license, frothiness, right? Figuratively, lust. And Jacob is saying this to say that basically you couldn't control your lust, right? Lasciviousness. And when you look up that word lasciviousness, it says here, it means a strong inclination toward lust, lewdness, or excessive sexual desire, often shown through wanton behavior, indecent acts, or words that excite sexual feelings, essentially being overly sensual, licentious, and lacking public decency. Now, I wouldn't say that this necessarily describes the tribe of Reuben, but Jacob is saying this concerning Reuben himself because of what he did. All right, that he couldn't control his desire or his lust, right? And when it says water here, I think it makes more sense to be like a flood, because you can't really control that. And even water to a degree, right? If you put water is going to take the shape of what it's in, right? You're not going to be able to control it. You're not a water bender. If you put water in a bowl, don't expect it to stand up like it's in a cup. Okay. But as it says, thou shalt not excel. And when you go into that word excel, right? Yathar. It says here to be left over, to remain. But when you go into the Chaldee lexicon, right, it says to abound, to be over and above, to be left, to be beyond measure, to exceed bounds, hence to be preeminent, to excel. And typically, Reuben being the firstborn, this would have been the blessing going to him, right? But because of what he did here, Jacob said, you wouldn't excel. So your tribe in the last days, as the nation continues to grow, your tribe wouldn't be recognized as the head tribe. They wouldn't have that glory. Like when we read on down, the glory that was attributed to Judah really would have been for Reuben, right? Had he not done this, but he was stripped of that, right? That glory of the firstborn, like the leader tribe, because of what he did here. Okay. And then it tells you that, right? Because you did this, that is what's going to be, that's what's going to befall your descendants after you. So let's close out a few of these. Verse 5. Simeon and Levi are brethren. Okay. And I also have the 12 tribes chart here. And Simeon, all right, you can see are the so-called Dominicans. That's what they're called today. And Levi are the so-called Haitians. Now it says here, Simeon and Levi are brethren, and the actual men, Simeon and Levi, were brothers. I mean, they were all brothers, but Simeon and Levi were brothers of the same father and the same mother, right? Being Leah, okay? And as it says, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations, all right? And when you go into that word instruments, you have the sense of like a tool, right? Or a mechanism used to bring about something. But it also goes into the let me not butcher the way that it was mentioned here. The way it's used in Genesis 49 here, right? It says here, the deceiver, or as to the deceiver, his instruments are evil, i.e., the devices which he uses to carry out his plans. Okay. And you see the use case here, Genesis 49 and 5. So Jacob says here, their instruments of cruelty are in their habitations, right? Meaning that the their plans or their means by which they accomplish, certain things, depending on what it is, are cruel. And back then, he's gonna give away, certain things they did for him to say this. Okay, but now dealing with Simeon and Levi, which are the so-called Dominicans and Haitians, which dwell on the same land, but it's divided, right? And Jacob is going to go into that as well. So it says here, "Oh my soul, come not thou into their seat." Oh, by the way, the instruments now, right? When you go to those areas, which is prevalent there, is left hand practices, right? Like the Haitians today is called voodoo, right? That they do, and not just that, they use, their other very brutal means by which they even deal with one another or those that they are against. But on the flip side, you also have Simeon, which also get into that brujeria and so on and so forth. You may not see it as much here in the U.S., but if you go to the actual, whole motherland, they would call it, in certain areas, villages, and so on and so forth, you'll if you don't think it's real, you'll find out how real it is when you get there. It says, "O my soul, come not thou into their secret, onto their assembly." When you go into their secret, it's like their inner council. And Jacob is basically saying, stay, like, "Oh my soul, stay away from their council, because, as it says, onto their assembly, i.e., their gathering, mine honor, be not thou united, i.e., united with them." Okay, it says here, "May I never join in their meetings. May I never be a party to their plans." Why? He's going to tell you. "For in their anger they slew a man." So Jacob is saying this in terms of being wary of how cruel they can be. And he gives an example, right? "In their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall." So let's deal with this first part. In their anger, they slew a man. When you go, which we read, right? We read that account in as we were going through Genesis, when Jacob had they were Jacob and his sons and those that were with him were in the land of Canaan. You had you had what's his name, Hamor, which is the father of Shechem. Shechem ends up graping, right, or sexually assaulting, as they would call it, um, Dinah, right. So he takes her by force, and she was a virgin. So he basically took that. After he took that, he came to talk to with his father Jacob and their brethren. And it says when Jacob found out, he held his peace until his sons came there, and they basically said, "Look, this is the situation that has transpired. Just let me, whatever the dowry is, you tell me, but just let me marry your daughter," because Shechem really wanted her. So they said, they communed amongst themselves, and more than likely it was Simeon and Levi that really spearheaded it. They basically said, "Oh, you know what? Cool, but we can't have her marry an uncircumcised heathen. So you and everybody in your city basically has to become circumcised, and only then will we agree." And they did that not to actually honor that, but they did that so they can have a handicap against them. Because when the men were healing from that circumcision, that's when they came and they struck and they slew them all. And Jacob was upset at that because, yeah, he was angry at what they did to his daughter, but he wasn't trying to go that far. But they did. And when he spoke to them about it, they basically said, "Yo, like, what do you mean? What did you expect us to do? We just gonna let them treat our sister like a whore?" So Jacob remembered that, right? And that's why he's recalling this and saying, they can be very cruel. And it's kind of like when David, basically, he would say all the time concerning Joab and Abishai, "Oh, ye sons of Zeruiah, you are too much for me." And then he after Joab had slain Abner, he said, "What? Basically, let David and his house um, be cleansed of this, because they had nothing to do on this, and let this all be upon Joab, because he did it right on his own." So similarly, like Jacob is saying here, may my soul not come into their secret, right? May I never join in their meetings, right, and never be a part of their plans, because they can be very cruel, and I don't want my honor to be stained by that. It says here, "And in their self-will, they dig down a wall." Now, when you actually go into the words here, it's not talking about an actual building. When you go into the word dig down, it goes into to huff, or to cripple or hamstring, they call it. And the self-will meaning in their like pleasure, for fun, playtime, pastime. Right? When you go into that word, what's that? Iquara. It says, if I'm pronouncing that right, to pluck up, to cut, to hamstring, right? It says here to pluck up, especially by the roots, specifically to hamstring, figuratively to exterminate, to dig down, to huff. Now, when we go into the lexicon, it'll be a bit clearer here, right? It says, okay, that's crazy work. To be overthrown, right? To hamstring, to huff a horse, by which the animal is rendered useless and unfit for work. It was anciently the practice of victors, and still is the case, thus to treat the horse or horses taken in battle when they cannot carry them away with them. So when they couldn't take the horses with them, they would huff them, right, or render them useless by, as it says, let me type this in here, hamstring / huff a horse or cattle or animal. Right, it says to sever the large tendon at the back of its hind legs, specifically around the hock joint, rendering the animal permanently crippled and useless for work or warfare. Now, this was a tactic historically used in ancient battles to disable enemy horses by making them unable to bear weight or move effectively. Huff comes from an old word for the joint hock, and the action disables the powerful hamstring muscles and Achilles tendon, preventing forward leg movement and causing the leg to collapse. Now, Jacob said here, right, in their self-will, right, and when you look at this um, in the NLT, it says what? For sport. So for fun, they basically huffed or crippled. When you go into that word, a wall, it's not talking about a building. Shawar, it says here ox, bull, right, for plowing. And that's like some animal cruelty type stuff right there. Okay. So as we keep on reading, Jacob says, right, cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and will scatter them in Israel. So knowing, right, who these tribes are, right, Simeon and Levi, the Haitians and the Dominicans, when you look at the island they're on, right, Hispaniola, they are divided, right? They're divided by land, and it's in the last days, right? Because when you actually go forward into the future, from when Israel became a nation and so on and so forth, this kind of division wasn't so between specifically, right, Simeon and Levi. Throughout the history of Israel, that wasn't the case. Okay, but now in these last days, this is the case, and it's well known. The mistreatment and the hatred and the division between the Dominicans, the so-called Dominicans today, and the so-called Haitians today. So when Jacob said, I will divide them in Israel and scatter them in Israel, that is to basically cause that tension that we see between them now, to where they don't, they're not united like they were before, because they can be real cruel, when they plot together like that. But I typed this in here, right? The hatred and division between Haitians and Dominicans. It says hatred and division between Haitians and Dominicans stem from a long, violent history, deep cultural/racial differences, which is interesting because they are of the same people, right? They're all Israelites. Economic disparities, territorial conflicts, and the Dominican Republic's anti-Haitian policies, including mass killings, they call it the Parsley Massacre, and mass deportations fueled by what? Racism and ideologies of Dominicanization to assert national identity. These tensions persist today, manifesting in border closures, walls, and ongoing human rights issues, despite shared island geography and economic interdependence. So why do you think that is? Well, it goes back to the prophecy concerning Simeon and Levi. Verse 8, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Right. So Judah, now concerning Judah, as they continue to grow, right, in the last days, they would take on that role, or that tribe. Their tribe would be in that role, in that stead, to where they would be praised, right? They would be praiseworthy. And why is that? Well, when you look at, for one, they made the head tribe, but number two, and it tells you that in First Chronicles, I believe the 5th chapter. But number two, if you notice, a lot of, not saying that, not to like take away from any of the other tribes, but a lot of great men came from the tribe of Judah, to the point of even Yahushua. Okay, the house of David, all of that, right, came from the tribe of Judah. So there were a lot of events that took place, and a lot of great things that these men did that made the tribe even praiseworthy. And the Lord did that to make them stand out for it, because, once again, pertaining to what Jacob is telling Judah over here, thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies, meaning what? You're going to have, they're going to be fierce, right? They're going to be strong. They're going to have, they're going to have dominion, because that's what it means when you have your hand in the neck of your enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Now, who was the father of Judah? Jacob. So who were his father's children? His brethren. And they bow down before you, meaning that that it goes back to that first sentence, right? Thou art he whom thy brethren will praise. This is another way of saying the same thing. Okay, that Judah would be that head tribe over the rest of the tribes. Verse 9, Judah is a lion's whelp, meaning Judah is a young lion. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. When it says here, yeah, from the prey, my son, thou art gone up. If you look at how a lion actually, operates, when it hunts, right, it catches its prey, it takes it down. Usually they go for the neck, jugular or whatnot, cut off the oxygen and so on. But eventually it takes down its prey, and then, it devours it. And once it's done, once it's taken over, it's conquered its prey, it'll eat and it'll get up and it'll go somewhere else, right? Because it's done. So going up from the prey signifies that you've basically, like a lion that has basically conquered or taken over or captured its prey, and now it's done, right? It's good. And that's like symbolizing Judah gaining that victory, right? That dominion once again, like a lion that has basically conquered its prey. And when you look at the history of Judah, they did do that. But once again, in the last days, in these times, which goes into the latter part of this prophecy here, once they get roused up, they're going to be like that young lion again. So it says here, he stooped down, he couched as a lion, as an old lion. Who shall rouse him up? So if you were to when you watch those videos when they go into the Sahara and they see a lion, once a lion is chilling, it's not hungry, it's done eating or whatever, and then it does its little they slouch or they lay down. That's when these those people that go in the little jeeps, they can get close, the cameramen and all that, because the lion at that point is not a threat, right? It's relaxed. It's like just chill, right? It's not in attack mode. It's not in defense mode. It's just there. Okay. Now, as it says, who shall rouse him up? When you look at this in the NLT, it says, like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him, right? Who dares to rouse him? Why? Because you know that even though this lion is in its it's in a relaxed or in a low state right now, it's still a lion. And if you provoke it, it is dangerous. Okay. So when you look at the condition of Judah today, throughout history, eventually they went from a fierce, warlike tribe, which all the tribes are like that. But when you deal with the times of King David and, the other feats that the tribe of Judah accomplished versus how throughout history, eventually leading into these last days, the Lord used certain events to bring us down to the point where, similar to a lion that is couched down and how it won't attack you, right, necessarily, and it's pretty much just there, right? You can get close to it and whatnot. That's how the Lord brought down Judah. So that's why when you see them today, most of them don't even realize the power that they have. Okay. Now they're still dangerous when they get turned up or roused up, but for the most part, they walk around and move around low, beat down, right? Not like a young lion, that you wouldn't mess with. And Esau saw that and capitalized off of it. But ultimately, the Most High is going to rouse him up, right? Through the spirit that he's going to put back on the earth. And that's going to turn the tribe of Judah back into that lion's whelp, right? Back into that young lion. Verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, right? And the scepter represents rulership, right? That's what a ruler would have, a scepter. Nor a lawgiver, which once again is a ruler, from between his feet, meaning from that line, until Shiloh come. And who is Shiloh? Yahushai. Now, when you actually look throughout the history, yes, you may say, well, you did have kings, right? You had King Saul, but then you really had, starting from King David, you had kings, and the Lord said that for David's sake, he would always have one to sit on the throne. So you did have kings, but then, somebody might say, well, when you go further on, eventually, when we were taken into captivity, we weren't really allowed to to be kings anymore, right? In terms of not to sit on the throne anymore, right? at at best, eventually, it became just like the high priest. But the actual, when you actually follow that line, the lineage of kings continued, even though they weren't, through captivity, they weren't sitting on thrones. That royal line all the way down from David, right, of actual kings, still continued up until Yahushua. That's why you're able to trace it through, because the Lord preserved it. All right. As it says, until Shiloh come, and when you go into that name Shiloh, they tell you that it's an epithet for the Messiah, right? Shayallah, he whose it is, that which belongs to him, meaning uncertain. When you look at the Strong's definition, it says here, Shiloh, an epithet of the Messiah. And an epithet is like a, what's a good way to put it? Let's just look it up. Like, I don't know, like a name or a title or something along those lines, right? It says here, an epithet, an adjective or descriptive phrase expressing a quality, characteristic of a person or thing mentioned. So yeah, there you go, like the great, right? Similar to how you had Antiochus Epiphanes, that was an epithet, which means God manifest. Okay, so as you can see, a title, a name, a label, a nickname. So going back to Genesis 49 and 10, it says, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Right, because, when Yahushua came on the scene, he's the one who basically started that gathering, right? And then he sent out, obviously the men, the disciples, and so on, to gather the lost sheep, right, of the tribes of Israel. Okay, and in these last days, it's still through Yahushua. But remember, the scriptures mentioned that he would raise up the tents of Judah first. Okay, so really, he gave the spirit and the word starting with Judah, and then the rest of the tribes joined in. Okay, and now we have what we have today. Verse 11, it says, binding his foal onto the vine and his ass's colt. Now the foal is a he ass when you go into it, like a male ass, which is a donkey. And his ass's colt. The colt is the baby of an ass. Onto the choice vine. He washed his garment in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. Now, when you deal with verse 11 and verse 12, it signifies, a couple of things, right? Number one, it goes into abundance, right? Because we know that Yahushua is going to, through him, that we are going to gain that abundance really of everything, right? Through him and his instruction of us onto righteousness. And when you go into the practice of the ancient world, nobody, right, especially not a farmer, would bind or tie their ass to a vine, okay, in their vineyard, because that's where you would have your vines. And nobody would tie their ass or donkey to a choice vine. A choice vine is a good vine. Why? Because it would either eat the leaves, eat the actual grapes, pull, or damage the vine, and vineyards weren't cheap. So why then, or what would it mean by you actually binding your ass to the vine or to the choice vine? That would signify abundance, right? Because when you have in abundance, then it's okay, right? It doesn't matter if the ass, eats of it or destroys it or, does anything of that sort, because it's not something that's limited. It's not, it's so much, it becomes almost expendable, right? So it's like a saying in the sense of highlighting, right, how much you will have, that things that maybe you normally wouldn't do for the sake of preservation, it really wouldn't be a big deal or wouldn't matter because you have so much. But it also signifies, when you read about the prophecy concerning Yahushua, right, Shiloh, and his arrival, I believe it's in the book of Zechariah. It mentions how he came lowly, riding upon an ass. And when you actually read the account, I think it's in Matthew or so, it mentions that, right, that he basically got an ass and he rode, I think it was into Jerusalem. and there were people running before him, waving palms, just basically chanting Hosanna and so on. Now, the signification in that is when you bind your ass, typically in the ancient world, because asses or donkeys were means of transportation, when you would get on the ass and it would take you where you needed to go, when you got off, you would actually tie it to, either like a tree or, something nearby. Today, it's like parking your car in a garage. And you would do that so that it wouldn't move, right? It wouldn't go anywhere. So it signified that you had arrived at your location, right? Wherever it is you were trying to go. It says here, he washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. So once again, dealing with that layer of abundance, right? Washing your clothes or garments in wine, it's not literal. Doesn't mean that you take off your clothes and you dip it in wine and start to wash it with it. No. It's signifying the blood of the grapes staining your garment. Now, the more you have, the more stained your garment would be. Okay, so on the one hand, that is like the layer of signifying the abundance. Okay, but it also signifies the destruction or the judgment that the Lord would bring with him. Right, Yahushua, that is. When you go to Isaiah the 63rd chapter, which we'll get in a second, he describes the judging or the destruction of people as him treading in the wine fat. Okay, to where they're likened onto grapes, and he's likened onto trampling upon them to the point where it stains his raiment. So let's go there real quick. Isaiah 63, verse. I think I should be good with this. Does it? Okay, cool. Isaiah 63, yeah, verse 1. Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. So Isaiah asks, the Lord answers. Then the question is, wherefore art thou red in thine apparel? So why are your clothes red? And thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat. The wine fat was like a little pit area. You would throw the grapes in there, you would stomp on them, and it would squeeze the juice out of the grapes, and then you would gather that and then make your wine and so on and so forth. In order to get the juice out, you would actually step, tread, jump, stomp it out, right? And stomping it out would spill it onto your clothes. So the question is, right, why do your garments look like one that treads in the wine fat? And the response was, I have trodden the winepress alone. He made an effort to mention this because typically this was an activity done, cheerfully, right, with multiple people. It says, and of the people, see, there was none with me. For what? For I will tread them in mine anger. Those are the enemies of the Lord, and trample them in my fury. And their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment. This is the Lord likening him destroying his enemies when he comes back to somebody treading in a wine press, right? Treading upon grapes. So going back to Genesis 49, which was, prophetic as well. And Isaiah saw that as well, because that's also what the Lord would do, right? In an analogical or metaphorical sense. Because he will literally destroy people, but he's not actually going to be they're spilling their blood on his garment and stuff. Verse 12, his eyes shall be red with wine and his teeth white with milk, right? So once again, going back to that abundance, right? When your eyes are red with wine, that means you drink a lot of wine, right? Because wine can make your eyes red. In fact, I looked it up here. It tells you that because of, I believe, the dilation of your blood vessels in your eye. It says, yes, drinking wine makes eyes red, primarily because alcohol dilates blood vessels in the eyes, increasing blood flow and making them look bloodshot. So that's where, you get that actual look from. But that means you drink a lot of wine. You can't drink wine without having wine. And you can't have wine, at least in that time, without a vineyard. And vineyards are not just cheap. Okay. So it mentions basically having so much that when you tread them, it's like you're washing your garment in wine, right? And as it says, his eyes shall be red with wine, which also, when you go to the New Testament, right, and you read it, they called Yahushua a wine bibber, right? So he drank wine, right? He liked wine. You could say he drank a lot of wine. Obviously, he wasn't a drunkard. And his teeth white with milk. When your teeth are white, it symbolizes nourishment, right? And as it says, with milk being in the ancient world, you would get milk from cattle, right? From cows, even from goats. And so having an abundance of milk also signified having an abundance of cattle and animals and so on and so forth. All right. So being nourished and having in abundance, right? And that's also another layer, because that's what Yahushua is going to bring, right? When he comes back, as he brings judgment, and he also, brings that righteousness and that joy and that reward with him. And there are many other prophecies that go into that, right? Every man sitting under his vineyard, and not being made afraid anymore and having peace. Verse 13, Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be for an haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. So now dealing with Zebulun, which forgot to mention, but Judah are the so-called Negroes, right? So-called African Americans. And Zebulun are those in the region from Guatemala to Panama, right? And I have here a map of Central and South America here. So when you look at, where is it at? Yeah, from Guatemala, that's Central America, right, to Panama, this region right here, it mentions that Zebulun is shall dwell at the haven of the sea. When you read this in the NLT, it says Zebulun will settle by the seashore and will be a harbor for ships. His borders will extend to Zidon. Okay, so now when you look at ancient Israel, Zebulun was right here. Zebulun was not their territory in ancient Israel was not a haven of ships, right? It wasn't a harbor for ships. In fact, they weren't even at the coast. So we know it's not talking about, where they were in ancient Israel, but where they would be in the last days. And having identified them with those in the region of Central America, it makes more sense, because when you look at the you have what's called the Panama Canal, which is exactly what is described over here, right? When you look at where it is, it's strategically placed, but it's between, two bodies of water. And it also allows for trade, because ships can go through, which we're going to read about the Panama Canal, but ships can go through without having to go all the way around the bottom end of South America in order to get across. So let's read here. This is dealing with the Panama Canal, and we'll read just a little bit about it. It says here, the Panama Canal is an artificial 82-kilometer or 51-mile waterway in Panama that connects the Caribbean Sea with the Pacific Ocean. It cuts it cuts across the narrowest point of the Isthmus of Panama, and is a conduit for what? For maritime trade between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And a conduit is like, it allows for things to happen, right? It says here physical geography and hydrology, or in physical geography and hydrology, a channel, which is in that sense how conduit would be used. But when you go into like the basic sense of what the word conduit is, conduit, right, a channel for conveying, as it says here, water or other fluid, a tube or troll for protecting electrical wiring. But it would allow, by protecting that wiring, it will allow the electricity to go through without it basically going all over the place, right? So basically, you can use the word channel for, to keep it short and sweet. Anyway, it's a channel, right, that allows for maritime trade between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. How does maritime trade happen? You need ships. Okay. It says locks at each end, and this is actually pretty cool that they do this, right? They basically created a artificial it's going to tell us here, uh, basically like an artificial lake or body of water. And because the two different oceans, like the Pacific and the Atlantic, are at different altitudes, like different heights, they would raise using the locks, the ships above, so it can trap onto the height of the lake, the artificial lake or river. That way it can travel across that, and then at the other end, they would lower it back down. As you can see here, using locks. So it says a lock is a device used for raising and lowering boats. And it says ships and other watercraft between stretches of water of different levels on river and canal waterways. So they will use the locks, right, at each end. It lifts up ships to the Guton Lake, which is an artificial freshwater lake of 26 meters above sea level, creating a damming and Chagres River. Oh, created by damming the Chagres River and Lake Alajuela, if I'm pronouncing that right, to reduce the amount of excavation work required for the canal. Locks then lower the ships at the other end. An average of 200 million liters, which is 52 million US gallons of fresh water, is used in a single passing of a ship. So that's basically what you have right there. But that's why, or one of the reasons why it's a harbor for ships. Okay. And then it says here, and his border shall be onto Zidon. Now, even when you look historically, Zidon is over here, right? Zebulon's actual border wasn't by there, and it damn sure is not by it now, right, over here in the Americas. So what would it possibly mean by the border being onto Zidon? Well, Zidon was also a coastal city, right? And so not looking at it in the sense of like the literal location Zidon, but what type of city or where it was by the coast. Okay, and likewise the border of Zebulon here, right, in Panama, in that region, would be by the coast, right, similar to what Zidon was. It says here, Issachar is a strong ass couching down between two burdens. This is, imagine, as it says in the NLT, and this is why I have this here, Issachar is a sturdy donkey, that's what an ass is, resting between two saddle packs. That's what the burdens are, right? If you look here at, let's see, a donkey between two saddles. These are all pretty good, but I want to see if they can show a much better two saddle packs. Yeah. So I suppose these. All right, there you go. Cool. So you can see here, this is an example. It's an ass, and that's what they did. They carried burdens from people to luggage to all of that. And you can see here, it would be strapped on each side of it. That's the two burdens, right? The things that it's carrying. So Issachar, which are, going back to the chart here, I believe we mentioned the ones we've gone over so far, right? Judah, Levi, Simeon, Reuben, and Zebulon, which we just covered, and Issachar, which are the so-called Mexicans today. It mentions here, right, is a strong ass couching down between two burdens. He saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. And when you go into the meaning of Issachar's, he is hired. And that bowing became a servant unto tribute, meaning like when they bow their shoulder to bear, this is them basically offering labor, right, to work. And why would they do that? Well, it says when he sees how good the countryside is and how pleasant the land, he will bend his shoulder to the load and submit himself to hard labor. And when you look at Issacharites, or so-called Mexicans, they do work hard, right? In fact, they're probably one of the most hardworking tribes out there. but they're always, if the job is right, then they're willing to do it, right? You'll see them doing, you know, sometimes it's jobs that most people wouldn't want to do, like hard labor or construction or whatever it is, but you'll see them, heavily doing that, because if there's a good enough reward from it, they'll do it. They'll labor, right? They'll do the work. But also, that's why when you go in dealing with the last days, that's why a lot of them try to come here, okay? Because to them, based on where they are, this land is likened onto, at least being sold, the dream of it, a good and pleasant land where you can have labor, you can come and work, you can make money, and then hopefully make enough to go back or take care of yourself. So that's why you see that a lot of them will try to come here and try to work. In fact, when this whole like ICE situation, when they catch a lot of like Central and South Americans, a lot of them, right, Issachar majority included, not just Issachar, but a good amount of places where they go to try to target them are workplaces, right? Workplaces, because they know that that's where they're going to be. They're going to be working. And then, in most cases, let's say they call them like illegal, right? They're working illegally. They don't have papers or whatever the case is. But going back to Issachar, this is a trait, a character trait of them, but also helps identify them, or you can highlight this about them, in today's day and age. All right. So as it says here, moving on to Dan, and if you notice, I'm not going too in depth, right, in these tribes. There are, trust me, numerous breakdowns on them. You literally, all you got to do is just type in Great Millstone or GMS 12 Tribes Breakdown or Genesis 49, and brothers have done tons and tons and tons of like videos going into the actual history of the people and all of that. The elders, as well. So a lot of great information there. So if you ever want more in depth, just type that in there. Verse 16. So dealing with Dan, it says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel, right? As it says, Dan will govern his people like any other tribe in Israel. And the word Dan in the Hebrew is Dan. Now you'll notice Dan is not on this 12 tribes sign here, though he was a son of Jacob. When you go, you hear about Dan in the Old Testament and some of those precepts there, but eventually as a people, you don't really hear much about Dan. And when you go to the book of Revelation about the tribes that were delivered, the tribe of Dan isn't listed in there. So the scriptures don't really go into like what exactly happened to Dan, more than likely obviously being like assimilated into the rest of the tribes. But the details of it and who they are today and so on, you can't really trace that or track that. So concerning Dan, we can really only use information about what we have about them in the scriptures, but that's how the Lord set it up, right? So it says here, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall back. So what is this? This is like a cunning, but also like an opportunistic like characteristic, right? Meaning like a serpent in a way, which it's laying low, but when it sees an opportunity, an adder in the path, saying the same thing here, it strikes, right? And it bites the horse, as it says, the horse's heel, which can be deadly. So just like a serpent, which will lay low or wait for the right opportunity and then strike, that was basically how Jacob described Dan, or how they would be. Now, one example also that comes to mind is, as we went through in the book of Judges, when Dan saw that their land was too small and they wanted more, they sent out a few men to go and scout out the region and find out where's like a good place they can go and dwell. And those men, this is in the book of Judges, those men basically went to a region north, right? And they found that that city was basically isolated. Like it didn't have allies. It didn't have, the Sidonians and them weren't close by. So what did they do? They saw an opportunity and they took it and they struck. They destroyed the people in the city and they took it over and it basically made it theirs. Okay. But we can't like grab this and say, oh, we're reading this and now we can identify that the tribe of Dan is these people today. We don't have that. Verse 18. I have awaited for thy salvation, O Lord, or O Yahweh. Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. And the tribe of Gad are the North American Indians, right, or the Native Americans. Um, and that troop that overcame them, when you go into the history, remember, we're dealing with the last days here, right? So yes, throughout history, yeah, they've been through many wars, but the troop that overcame them was dealing with the U.S. cavalry, right, with the wars that they fought with them, but eventually they were overcome. Okay, so let's pull that up. Yeah, here, wars between, yeah, wars between the North American Indians and the U.S. cavalry, right? And there are quite a few here, but it says here the Great Sioux or Sioux, if I'm pronouncing that right, forgive me if I'm not, War of 1876 and Little Bighorn. Following the gold discovery in the Black Hills, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho united to defeat Custer's 7th Cavalry, though it led to increased U.S. military pressure to confine tribes to reservations. That was that troop that overcame them, and it was for prophecy's sake. Red River War. This is 1874 to 1875. U.S. Army campaigns against Southern Plains tribes, the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho, who left reservations, ending their resistance on the plains. The Apache Wars. Decades of conflict in the Southwest, notably involving Geronimo's band against U.S. forces, until his surrender in 1886. The Nez Perce War. The U.S. Army pursued Chief Joseph and his band of Nez Perce for hundreds of miles as they attempted to flee to Canada. And then you had the Wounded Knee Massacre, the tragic final major armed conflict where the 7th Cavalry massacred hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children, effectively ending large-scale Native American resistance. Hence, they were overcome. Okay, but as it says here, but he shall overcome at the last. Okay, so they were overcome at that time for prophecy's sake. In fact, all of us were, but the Lord is going to raise us up in these times, right? And that includes the tribe of Gad. And the same ones that overcame us, right? That same nation of people, you saw Edom, we will overcome them, right? And basically, when you go into the scriptures, the Lord mentions how Israel is going to be his weapons and his battle axe and weapons of war. And with thee will I break in pieces the horse and his rider. Interestingly enough, back then, that's exactly who it was that was overcoming Gad, the horse and their rider. Okay. It says, out of Asher, his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. And Asher is dealing with the Colombians to Uruguayans, right? So if we look up here, where's my map? We're dealing with a good vast majority of South America, right? Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Brazil, Suriname, all of this area, okay? From Colombia to Ecuador, Peru to Uruguay. And it said here that his bread shall be fat, right? Now the bread represents like food, but where does food come from? The earth. And what that signifying is the land, right? The region where they would be very resourceful. Okay. And he shall yield royal dainties, meaning from their land. You could say they would export, right? You could export out of there a lot of royal dainties, which are a lot of goods, okay? Just for a lack of a better word. So I looked up here, exports from South America. It says here, South America's exports are heavily focused on primary commodities, agricultural products, right? The dainties and the bread being fat, soy, coffee, meat, corn, sugar, fruits, minerals, right? Copper, iron ore, tin, zinc, and energy, crude oil, natural gas. They got all of this coming out of there. Brazil and Colombia are major players. Well, guess where and what tribe Brazilians and Colombians are from? Asher, right? Colombia, Brazil. And not just them, but as it says, they are major players, with Brazil leading in fuels and oil seeds, while Colombia exports significant oil and coffee. See, manufactured goods like aircraft and vehicles are growing but remain secondary to raw materials. So that also goes to show you, and links up with what was mentioned concerning Asher. And Naphtali is a hind let loose. A hind is like a deer, like a female deer, let loose. He giveth goodly words. And a hind let loose signifies like that. If you let a hind loose, it's gonna roam freely, right? Like being free, being at peace. It's not, it's not pressed. It's not chased. It's sort of living that free roaming lifestyle, right? And the giveth goodly words goes into their hospitality. Okay, now Naphtali, when we look them up here, that is the from Argentina to Chile, right? So right down here in South America, and you can see their land is pretty vast over here too. Now, when you look up the culture, right, of them, it'll tell you, right, that free spirit, that free Roman lifestyle. In fact, they have a practice or culture, right, known as the Gaucho, right, tradition. And when you read it, it says the Gaucho tradition is the iconic, free-spirited culture of South American horsemen from the Pampas, Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil. Okay, so you're looking over here, right? You can see Uruguay, Argentina, and it mentions that, but obviously, just like in ancient Israel, when you pull this up here, you would find those of Naphtali or even Judites in Ephraim, right? You would find, Levites all around. So it's not like, yeah, these were their primary regions, but it's not like you could never find anybody other than a Gadite in the land of Gad. Likewise, when you look at this map here, it's divided this way, but that's, to help identify predominantly where they would be. But it doesn't mean that you would have only those of Asher up in this region, or only those of Naphtali down here. Okay, so reading a bit more, it says here, centered in cattle herding, horsemanship, and deep community, expressed through iconic foods like asado, churrasco, or fire roasted meat, sharing yerba mate, traditional clothing, ponchos, bombachas, guitar music, and a strong code of honor, hospitality, and bravery, right? And that's the characteristics right there, which is like that unconfined, free, as it says, free spirited living, lifestyle, but also with hospitality and bravery, right? Which is that of, like it described them as, a hind let loose. Verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bowl. A fruit, the word fruitful bowl goes into, I believe there's ban, yeah, which is a son or children. Okay, so it says here, right, son, children, and Joseph is referring to the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, because they came of Joseph. So that blessing would manifest in the form of the tribes that came from Joseph, which were Ephraim and Manasseh. And remember, Ephraim got the greater blessing, right? Manasseh was blessed too, but Ephraim got the greater blessing. So as it says, it's a fruitful bowl, and that's why, once again, Manassites are also fruitful, but Ephraim are more fruitful, right? Very fruitful. Very, very, very fruitful. That's a joke. So that fruitful bowl, meaning like they're very fertile, right? They reproduce a lot. That's just that's just a characteristic about them, right? Even a fruitful bowl by a well. Okay, and that's also going into, because those that came of Joseph are the tribe of Ephraim, which are the Puerto Ricans, and the tribe of Manasseh, which are the Cubans, right? If we look up here, you'll see here, you have Cuba right over here. And let's see if we can find, where's Puerto Rico? There you go, right here, this little island over here. And it describes it as what was it? A well a fruitful bowl by a well. Now, if you look at an actual branch or tree that's by a well or a body of water, it's going to be well nourished because it has water. It's never going to die of like lack of water, right? Or be drained. And when you look at um, Puerto Rico, okay, they do have that great resource of water too. But the name Puerto Rico or Puerto Rico, right? I believe it means rich port. Let's see, meaning of Puerto. Yeah, yep. Just give me that. Yeah, a rich port, and it said they called them that, right? They called them that because of what? Named by explorers due to the gold found there and its importance as a what? Trading harbor. Okay, so going back to that's dealing with Ephraim, and when you look them up, I guess ethnically, right? They were also referred to as the Tainos, of which came like the Cubans, Dominican Republic. It has it there, right? And Puerto Rico and so on and so forth, right? So when you talk about the Tainos, they basically, um, it says here, Taino-derived customs and identities can be found, especially among marginalized rural populations on the Caribbean islands, such as of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. Okay. And so going back to this description at bottom, right, it says whose branches run over the wall. When you go into the word branches, it goes into, once again, descendants. And I believe that might go into children or daughters. Bath, right, daughter. Okay, so you had the fruitful bowl, which were the bun or the sons or children, and then you have the branches, which are the daughters. And this just signifies their descendants. Okay, and when it mentions whose branches run over the wall, it's signifying migration, right? Because when you go into history, once again, we're dealing with the end times, right? When you go into recent modern history, you'll see that there was a period of time where there was a great migration, especially dealing with the Northern Kingdom with Ephraim, other tribes as well, but mainly with Ephraim coming here to the Americas. Okay. And let's look in here. It says here, fruitful bowl by a well, whose branches run over the wall. Because sometimes these words in English, they'll say one thing, but when you go into the Hebrew, it's another. But here, as you can see, it's a wall. All right. And that's referring to that border or that crossing here into this land, right, into the Americas or North America. It says here, the archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. And these archers represent the colonizers, conquistadors, the same ones that we read here that the Spanish, right, that renamed it or named it Richport. They were likened onto the archers, as it says, that grieved him and shot at him. And this was symbolizing them basically attacking and making war, okay, against them and conquering them. Even though, and why did it grieve them? Because when they came and they arrived, Jake here showed them hospitality, right? But in return, this was how they repaid him. Okay, and the things that are mentioned about Joseph apply to Ephraim, but they also apply to Manasseh because they both come of Joseph. But it applies in more force to Ephraim because remember they had once again the greater blessing, right? So yes, Manasseh fruitful, but Ephraim is more fruitful. Okay, and Ephraim and the other of the northern kingdom suffered, right, the attacks at the hand of the conquistadors, let's just put it that way, or the colonizers, right, the Edomites. But so did those in Cuba, right? So did the Manassites, and really so did the other tribes as well. So even though in Genesis here it doesn't mention Ephraim and Manasseh, when it says Joseph, it's applying to them. It says here, but his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. So even though they were they fought against them and so on, the Lord still preserved them, okay, in their defense, in their fighting back, right? And so some places they were overcome, some worse than others, but the Lord still had mercy, as it says, and his bow abode in strength. So their blessing was not overcome, okay, by the strong arming of Esau. It says, by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Okay, i.e., reading it in the NLT, and his arms were strengthened by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the shepherd, the rock of Israel. It's just all describing the Yahweh Ba'asham Yahweh Shai. Even by the God of thy father, so the God of Jacob, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven above, the blessings of the deep that lieth under, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. And that's why they were so fruitful. Okay. And the greater part of that blessing went to Ephraim. Remember, that's why Jacob crossed his hand to make sure his right hand was on the head of Ephraim, even though Ephraim was the younger out of the two between him and Manasseh. So this is a great blessing that that Jacob blessed Joseph and his sons with. It says here, the blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors onto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. Sheesh. Damn. It says, they shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. Reading this in the NLT, it says, may the blessings of your father, that is Jacob, surpass the blessings of the ancient mountains or ancestors, reaching. Okay, that's enough. That's enough. You can hide that. You know what? There you go. Reaching to the heights of the eternal hills. May the blessings rest on the head of Joseph, who is a prince among his brothers. And also, when you read more into the scriptures, you'll notice that there are times when Joseph is synonymous with Ephraim, right? There are times when they will mention Joseph and Manasseh, and that Joseph is referring to Ephraim. Okay, but basically, this is a blessing, extra portion that Jacob gave to Joseph, which would apply to his sons. Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Now, when you go into that word raven, remember here, Jacob is likening what the descendants of Benjamin will be like to a wolf. Okay, so it says here, raven, to tear, to rend, to pluck. When you go into the Chaldee lexicon, right, it says, was it to pluck off, to be fresh, to pull, to tear in pieces. It can also be a metaphor used of anger, right? So going back, referring to Benjamin, and it also goes into their fierceness, because Benjamin was a fierce tribe as well. When you go into the history of Israel, remember when the wicked men of Benjamin had sexually assaulted the Levite's concubine, and Benjamin ended up going to war with the tribes. Basically, it was them against the rest of the 11 tribes, and they smoked them twice until the Lord gave them up into their hand. Right? It was said that they could hurl stones, in slings with precision of like within a hair's breadth. Okay. Look at how thin a hair is, and they could still hit it. All right. But as it says, shall raven as a wolf, the comparison to a wolf when it says in the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. A wolf is a crepuscular creature. What that means is they're most active in the mornings and at night, or dawn, right? Dawn and dusk, like cats. When you look up here, crepuscular, it says of resembling or relating to twilight, of an animal appearing or active in twilight. So that's before sunrise or after sunset. And that's why he mentions here, in the morning, right, he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil, likening Benjamin onto that wolf. When we went into that word raven, it mentioned that anger, right? And so yes, they're fierce, but this is also describing their character trait of being, let's say, strong spirited. Most times you see See, Benjamin, and they might, the second you say hi, it's like they already hate you, they're already angry at you. Not everyone, but it's like that character trait is so strong that it's even earned them like stereotypes, right, about them being just like very angry or very rude, you might say, in their speech, right, and in their manner, in their conduct. They don't play, they're quick with it. Now, um, when you that they also express that through their music, okay, and that's why like you hear like the reggae music and all that. That is also an expression of that trait or that characteristic about them, right? That obviously some directed into music, not all, but when it mentions in the morning, because once again, when the wolves are most active, it's in the morning or in the night. So when they turn up, right? When they're in that peak mode, like a wolf in the morning or a wolf at night, they're gonna devour. Okay, but when you look at Benjamin, this was more so describing the trait, right, the character trait of their descendants, and that's why they are the way they are now. In fact, like you even have people that make memes about it. But verse 28 it says, "And Benjamin are the," before I move on, Benjamin are the tribe, the West Indians, right? So Jamaicans, just pull it up on here. Matter of fact, let me just type it. Maybe just give me a list. West Indian. Oh, yeah. So here you go. Right. I believe Trinidadians. Yeah, Trinidadians should be on there. The Bahamas, Jamaica. It's just most people when they think of Benjamin, they think of Jamaicans, right? But you have others today, right, that are not, obviously Jamaicans, but they're in the same region. Let's see if I can pull it up here, if we can find where they at. Yeah, I'm not looking too deep, but right around there. So going back, verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is it that their father spake unto them and blessed them, every one according to his blessing, he blessed them. And he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. So basically, don't bury me here in Egypt. You got to take me back to my forefathers' burying place and bury me there. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The purchase of the field and of the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And we read about that when Abraham actually bought that. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into his bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathered unto his people, meaning he died. And that brings us to the end of the book of Genesis, the 49th chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham Yahushai, Bahasham Recha Kodash. And until next time, Shalom.